What's your thoughts on government cover-ups or covert societies attempting to control humanity? Do you believe in ancient astronauts, intergalactic communication, or extraterrestrial visitations? Ever had an experience with disembodied spirits or the paranormal universe? Are these subjects fact or fiction? Each week, Tony and Eddie explore these unbelievable realities and beyond. Exclusively on Truth Be Told.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie, where we believe an experience becomes truth. I'm your host, Tony Sweet, and joining me while Eddie Connor is on tour, we have famed astrologer Rachel Lang and radio personality Captain Ron. Tonight, our esteemed guest is Tom Carey, author of the book, The Children of Roswell. Most people touch on the actual incident in Roswell, but not many talk about the aftermath of the incident, how it has affected the families and all involved, and Tom will discuss that and his findings today. Tom Carey has authored or co-authored more than 40 published articles on Roswell. He has appeared as a guest on many radio and TV shows, including Coast to Coast with Art Bell and George Norrie, Larry King, and in 2007, his co-authored book, Witness to Roswell, Unmasking the 60-Year Cover-Up, which was a bestseller, as was the sequel, Witness to Roswell, Unmasking the Government's Biggest Cover-Up. So much to talk about with our guest today, so please welcome to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. We have Thomas J. Carey. Thomas, how you doing? I love to watch the reactions when people hear the applause because they're not used to it. So
Is there a studio audience?
Yes, we have a studio audience waiting for you. Well, thank you so. Well, thank you so much for being here. This is so great, and I have to say, in the 3 years that Eddie and I have been doing this, we've touched on different ancient sites and UFO incidents and historical figures that have changed the world and America in itself, but we've never talked about Roswell at all, and I cannot believe it.
I
The
can't
biggest
believe
case.
it either. I know.
Yes.
It's so huge.
I know. but if you're going to have somebody talk about Roswell, this is the man to do it.
Absolutely.
Yes,
So, all right.
for
So,
sure.
first of all, I want to know, let's go back to before you have written books and been on television and started the career into the ufology. Where did it...
Did you say career?
So, well, whatever you like to call it. But what did you? How did you get started in this? Because this is fascinating. Everybody has a story to tell to all of us that piques our interest, that piqued your interest. So we thought you'd give us yours.
Well, that's a good question. I wanted to be a baseball player in my youth. And I did have several offers from major league teams.
Wow.
But I turned them all down, believing that if I held out, the offer would go up. And,
How'd that go?
Unfortunately, the year that I wanted to sign, I got very sick with the tonsillitis. And I lost a lot of weight. And we had a very short season at Temple University. And so when that season was over, my phone did not ring.
Oh, no.
In those days, we were subjected to the draft. So I joined the Air Force rather than be drafted by the Army. So I spent 4 years in the Air Force and started taking courses at McClellan Air Force Base in California, Sacramento, in anthropology.
Oh, wow.
So when I left the Air Force, I went to graduate school in anthropology and I got a master's at California State University in Sacramento in anthropology and went on to the University of Toronto to get a PhD. Didn't quite get it, but I fell in love with the sport of hockey.
Oh, wow.
So you're trying to get sports in there.
Exactly.
Yes, once an athlete, it's tough to turn off the athletic gene,
That's true.
So I came back to Philadelphia. By that time I was married and had 2 children, and so I got a job, to to pay the rent. And in the meantime, I rekindled a teenage interest in UFO now in the mid 1980s. And I read a book along the way called The Roswell Incident.
Mm-hmm.
And it just blew me away because we're talking about a case that's not just lights in the sky or a single witness or nothing to show for it. Here was a case alleging a crash of a physical ship back in 1947. A lot of witnesses. Government comes in, Air Force comes in, swears everybody to silence, and the case disappears from history for 30 years until it was reopened in the late 1970s, which resulted in that book that I read called The Roswell Incident. So when I read that book, my interest in the rest of UFOs just faded away. It became that one case. There was so much there that I couldn't get enough to read about it. So along about 1990, there were these two fellows who were investigators for the J. Allen Hynek Center for UFO Studies in Chicago,
Right.
Kevin Randall and Donald Schmidt, who were reopening the Roswell case after, the book came out in 1980 and it went 10 years without anything more. And they were reopening the case, and I subscribed to the journal that was published monthly by the organization that they were investigating for. And so I said, part of this story is the allegation that the craft that crashed back in 1947 was discovered by a team of archaeologists who were out there in the New Mexico desert at the time looking for archaeological sites. And it turned out that they supposedly were from the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where I was living at the time. So I called up Kevin Randall, one of the two investigators. I said, "What have you done about trying to find the archaeologists you say were out there in the field and discovered this thing?" He said, "Well, we interviewed one or two people, but we didn't get anywhere, and so we really haven't done anything with it." So I said, "Look, the University of Pennsylvania is where I live in Philadelphia. Let me go down there because I have a background in anthropology and archaeology. Let me go down there and see what I can find." So that was 1991. And that's when I started my active investigation on this case with the team of Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt. Well, Randall and Schmidt wrote a book in 1991, UFO Crash at Roswell, which I believe is the best book ever about Roswell. The best one were the two that Don Schmidt and I wrote and became bestsellers. So that reopened the case. And so that was 1991. So the couple of years go by. Randall and Schmidt, they write a second book in 1994. The case is becoming bigger and bigger and bigger. So by 1997, the case is now on the front cover of Time magazine because it's the 50th anniversary year of the alleged incident. It was on Time magazine. CNN covered it. All the networks covered it. It was the high point of interest in the case. Well, I wanted to continue investigating the case. So did Don Schmidt. And most of the other investigators left the field at that point. Most of the books on Roswell were written in 1997, the 50th anniversary year.
Right.
Don and we teamed up as a team in May of 1998. And we've been a team ever since. So that's 18 years.
Wow, it's a long time.
18 years we've been a team. We've written 4 books now on what we've discovered. And the most recent one being the Children of Roswell, a 7-decade legacy of fear, intimidation, and cover-ups. And that's the current book that came out this year. So that's how I got interested in Roswell. That's how I became an active investigator. And we are told that our books are the best ever written about Roswell.
Well, it sounds like your passion is what's really driven you for this, and I do find it fascinating when somebody, it's like a calling for someone to seek the answers, where many of us want to know the answers, we just don't have that calling and really to put the time and effort into it. What was one of the first, I guess, discoveries that when you started doing your research that was kind of the aha moment?
Yes. When I started in 91, the story had 2 crash sites, one near the town of Roswell and one 150 miles to the west of Roswell on the plains of San Augustine. And the story was that the ship was struck by lightning near Roswell and it exploded, but the remainder of the ship continued west and crashed on the plains of San Augustine. And there was this fellow who had come forward. Now, in 1989, do you remember the TV show called Unexplained Mysteries?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Unsolved
Yeah,
Mysteries, Robert Stack?
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, in the fall of 1989, their first show that fall was the full hour was devoted to Roswell. And a lot of witnesses came forward because at the end of the show, they would say, "You too can help solve a mystery. Please contact the number below the credits if you have something to give, like a witness or some information." Well, a number of witnesses came forward. One was a fellow by the name of Gerald Anderson. He claimed to have been a witness to the crash site as a 5-year-old boy back in 1947. And not only that, he said that he was out there with his brothers just looking around, excuse me, for certain types of rocks, rock hunting. And they discovered this spaceship. And up comes this team of archaeologists led by a fellow he called Van Buskirk, a professor. And he drew an identikit sketch of this professor. Well, my first trip down to the University of Pennsylvania, I went to the library, the anthropology library. I looked up Buskirk or Van Buskirk, and lo and behold, there was a book written by this fellow in about the 1970s, 80s, something like that, called the so-and-so Apaches living off the land up until 1950. And unfortunately, the book that I found on the shelf did not have a dust cover, so it didn't have a picture of him. So I sent away to the University of Kansas for the dust cover. And lo and behold, the dust cover comes back, and the picture on the dust cover of this, his name was Dr. Adrian Buskirk, not Van Buskirk, but was a match for this identikit sketch that Gerald Anderson had drawn for the police. And Buskirk was older, of course, but it was a definite match. So I called up Buskirk. He lived in Texas, San Antonio, and he said, "What are you talking about?" In the summer of '47, he was over in Arizona doing research for his PhD thesis. He had no interest in, and he was sort of outraged that somebody had pointed the finger at him as being at the crash site in 1947. Well, it turned out that this led us to to question this Gerald Anderson, the rest of his story, and he turned out to be as phony as a $3 bill.
Oh no.
And it also took away that Plains of St. Augustine crash site from the Roswell incident. Has nothing to do with the Roswell incident of 1947. Nothing. So that was sort of a big deal because we were searching in several places, and it eliminated the Plains of St. Augustine. It eliminated this Gerald Anderson, and we could focus more on the site closer to Roswell, and that's what we did. And it turned out we sort of have nailed the case, so to speak. That was my first big discovery,
and that's. I mean, it'd make me want to
Yeah,
keep
exactly.
going forward too.
Yeah.
Before I don't want to hog the time up between Captain Ron and Rachel here, but I'm never a skeptic. I believe in UFOs. I mean, when I was a child, my family saw at least what we thought was a UFO. But one thing that you said that it kind of baffles me a little bit, when you said that the UFO was struck by lightning and it took it down. My thing is like, how does a UFO travel through dimensions, through asteroid fields, outdo any of our military? How does one lightning take down a UFO?
We get that question all the time. How could a ship be built by somebody that travel the universe only to come to New Mexico and crash?
Right.
Well,
Right.
the thing is, any manufactured, and I'm just repeating what's been told to me, any manufactured alloy has its tensile strength, beyond which, if it's exceeded, it will come apart. So whatever caused the ship to explode, whether it was an internal explosion, something one of the occupants pressed the wrong button, or something external, like a lightning strike, which is in July of every year in New Mexico, you have what they call the monsoon season there, where you have these huge lightning storms. And you've never seen lightning like this, at least I haven't. And it's speculation, of course, but our speculation is that it was either an internal explosion, something caused it to explode, or if it was external, it most likely had to be a lightning strike, because the witnesses that we talked to said that they heard during this storm an explosion that was not a thunderclap, but something else exploded. Wow. So, we speculate that that's what it was.
Well, that's one thing that popped in my head, so I thought I would ask it.
Yeah. Do you are there other similarities, like when you're listening to these stories? Are there common threads that run through them, or similarities in the experiences?
You mean from the different witnesses?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Especially what the bodies look like. Well, we believe that there were 5 occupants in the ship, 4 of which died either in the explosion or falling to Earth. 1 survived. There was 1 survived alien occupant. And the thing is, all of the witness descriptions of these little bodies and the one that was alive all match up pretty much. 3.5 to 4 feet tall, very frail body with a very large inverted pear-shaped head, and wide set eyes, no nose, just 2 little holes in the front of the face where the nose would be, and no ears, just 2 little holes at the side of the head where the ears would be. And the only differences are the coloration, and we think that the different colorations described has to do with the age of the bodies when they were seen and the lighting circumstances. So they've been described as greenish pink, brownish pink, tannish, something like that. But we think those are all because of the state of decay and the lighting circumstances under which they were viewed. But the descriptions match up, and these are people that don't know one another. and there were no antecedents. One fellow once told me, "Oh, they saw what they wanted to see." Well, you're talking about 1947.
True.
They had no antecedents of what aliens look like other
Right.
than the comic books, and in the comic books, they were everything. From something with 6 arms to something with 3 heads. They had no antecedents which to base their descriptions on, but yet they all matched.
Did they say what type of species? Maybe the gray, or is that something that sounds very similar to a gray? But
Well, back then they didn't have what they called grays. It's a recent concept, but to answer your question, that's basically what they looked like. Yes.
right, okay, that's what I thought.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, Tom, do you find it frustrating? Do you see people today that still don't believe or buy into the whole Roswell thing? I mean, obviously
Yeah.
this is the biggest case, and I'm sold on it. Tony's sold on it. I think you're
Yes,
sold on
definitely.
it. Is it frustrating for you to find people that still don't buy into it at all? There's so much evidence, and you've met so many of these people.
It's frustrating when they tell you that, but they haven't read the books.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Most of them who are they just don't accept it. They'll say, "Oh, the government couldn't keep a secret." Well, they kept it for 30 years.
Right.
It started leaking in the late 70s.
Well, that's my point, Tom. I was going to say, I've obviously read the books, and it is so compelling to me, as I'm sure it is to you, when you read these things. You guys have deathbed confessions from these 90-year-old guys who were colonels in the Army. Why would a guy do that? It's like, my thinking is, you don't drive down the 405 with a gun to your head in a white Bronco if you didn't do anything wrong. I also don't think you if you're a colonel in the Army,
Well.
you don't go through the trouble of having this thing prepared,
Yeah.
put away in a safe till your death to be opened, which states, "I saw bodies, I saw." Who's going to go through that trouble?
It's true.
Right, especially if you've already had a successful life. Why would you want to sully it with a UFO story, especially Roswell? If you say you saw bodies, they'll say, "Oh, he's not a serious person.
Right.
He's just not serious." So that's why most of your professional people, like doctors, lawyers, politicians, news people. I'm not talking about cable, but your mainstream news people. The subject of UFOs is still, after all these years, taboo, because it conjures up phony witnesses, people telling stories that aren't true, and so they just stay away from it. And the people who have told me they just don't buy Roswell, and when you talk to them, their reasoning is just a belief. It's not based on any facts.
Right, they haven't heard that testimony or read your book to
Yeah.
counter it, which is really frustrating, number one. But
And
once
they
you have it, don't you think that this is so compelling? I mean, what do you do? I mean, you're still chasing it, which I think is so great. How do you convince these people?
We don't try. We just say, this is what we believe happened. Have you read our book? Yes, no. Well, read one of our books, then get back to me, because it's these people are. They don't, basically their minds are closed. They have closed minds. They don't want to hear. They don't want to know. So you're just wasting your time. We learned that early, so I don't waste my time on them.
Well, go ahead, Rachel.
Oh no! Well, I was just going to ask, what kinds of measures did the government do to keep people quiet?
They broke the rules. Today we would call them civil rights violations. Back in 1947, all of you are too young to remember because you weren't born yet. But back in 47, our military had just won World War II. And they were held in the highest regard that we had ever held them, at least that I can remember. So when the military said something, they tended to be believed. Well, here we had a situation that they had never had before. And when I like the quote that one of the officers at the Roswell base told his daughter, who told us, she asked him, "Why did you cover it up, Daddy? Well, why did you cover this up?" He said, "Well, we were faced with a technology greater than our own, and we didn't know what their intentions were." So when you don't know something, I spent 4 years in the Air Force, and when you don't know something, you don't advertise it. You keep it keep it quiet. And I'm sure that their feeling was, well, let's wait till we find out what's going on here before we announce anything. Also, the chief guy of the Air Force at the time, uh, General Carl Spaatz, was away on vacation. So the next guy in line was a four-star general, soon to become the chief of staff of the Air Force. His name was General Hoyt Vandenberg in Washington. He had remembered the 1938 War of the Worlds radio broadcast that had sent the East Coast of the United States in a panic. Orson Welles, it was the Mercury Theater of the Air, I think it was called. Even though they announced that a rendition of H.G. Wells' story of the attack from by Martians. And they did it in the form of a news broadcast. Well, a lot of people came in late to the show. They didn't hear the upfront disclaimer and thought, oh my goodness, we're being invaded. This is a news broadcast. We're being invaded. And New Jersey especially went into panic. So he remembered that Vandenberg did. And he says, I don't want to be responsible for a panic in the streets. And he also was afraid that maybe our religious institutions would collapse, our financial institutions. So there were a lot of bad things on his mind that he thought might happen if they all of a sudden announced, hey, folks, we got visitors from Mars or wherever they're from. And so he didn't want to take a chance. So they covered it up. Now, how do you cover this up? Because the first story went out into the media on July the 8th, 1947, it was already out there. They had recovered a flying saucer. Well, they had to kill that story, so they killed it the next day with the weather balloon story. Now, they'd have been better off had they said, well, it was one of our top secret fighters, a new alloy. But no, they came up with this cockamamie weather balloon story that nobody believes. And we wouldn't be here talking about it if they had come up with a good story.
Right. That's
right.
It's true.
How can you mistake a balloon, a rubber balloon, with a tinfoil kite, trailing a tinfoil kite for something that came from another planet? Now that's pretty hard to digest.
I totally agree.
So the media bought it hook, line, and sinker, because even then they didn't like UFOs. They did not like UFO stories because it damaged their credibility. UFO stories were front page news at that time. Every day, the next sighting. Well, the next group that they had to silence were the airmen that were on the Roswell base, the air base just south of Roswell, who were involved in the recovery. There were maybe somewhere between 90 and 150 airmen who they used to help pick up the pieces. They had to be silenced. Plus, the story had gone around the base like wildfire. Everybody on the base was talking about the story. So what they did is they threatened the military guys on the base with imprisonment at Leavenworth, in Leavenworth Prison in Kansas. They said they would gather them together in a hangar, and they said, okay, you guys, whatever you think happened out there today didn't. And if you want to read more about it, you can read about it and talk about it in Leavenworth.
Wow.
So they got the message and they shut up.
Yeah.
Now, the real problem was the civilians who lived in Roswell and lived on the ranches around Roswell, who knew about this and who had gotten to the crash site and had seen everything. How do you silence them? Because there's no direct chain of command from the military to civilians as far as controlling them. Only in time of war or time of emergency, where where martial law is declared, can a military command dictate to a local population. And this didn't apply. So what they did is they used the sheriff of Roswell, or of Chavez County, based in Roswell, to threaten civilians that they knew had seen the bodies or that were out at the site. If you talk about this, we're not only going to kill you, we're going to kill your entire family, including
Wow.
your children.
Insane.
And so they used the sheriff, and they used a certain officer on the base to also do that in the civilians that the sheriff didn't want to do it to. You know, he says, I can't tell Joe, who I know, that I'm going to kill him. So they would bring this officer out named Arthur Philbin. He was a first lieutenant. He was the town liaison for the base, but he delivered the death threats to family members if they ever talked about it. So that's how they controlled the story. It was a 2-day story in 1947, July 8 and July 9. And then it was gone for 30 years until the base intelligence officer at Roswell, Major Jesse Marcel, broke his silence in 1978. And here we are.
Well, that's quite a story. I mean,
Yeah.
quite a story. What we're going to do, though, we're going to take a quick break for our sponsor. And when we come back, we're going to talk more with Tom Carey. He has the book, The Children of Roswell. And that's what we're going to talk about is some of the stories that it's not necessarily the people of that time. It's always the children and descendants of some of the people that were on site or people that dealt with the incident. So we're going to be right back. This is On Over Tony Sweet, Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm Tony Sweet.
Rachel Lang.
Captain Ron.
And we're going to be right back more with Tom Carey. Don't go anywhere. Do you suffer from anxiety, from depression, maybe even chronic pain? Well, listen up. Truth Be Told is going to tell you about a breakthrough program built on over 100 years of therapies used in America's returning veterans to help you successfully overcome PTSD, anxiety attacks, pain, and depression. The secret proven in study after study. Music therapy. The effects of music are nothing short of amazing. From strokes to PTSD, music has been shown to improve the quality of life. Now, one of the latest music therapy programs being used in America's veteran hospitals can be yours to experience for free at home and to help your own anxiety attacks, pain, and depression. Or just relax after a hard day. It's called Whole Tones. It takes music therapy to a new level. This revolutionary program makes use of specifically designed frequencies that have been shown to stimulate your body's natural healing power down to a cellular level. If it works for battle-scarred vets, can it work for you? Well, experience it for yourself for free at sweetwholetones.com. Like Tony Sweet, that's SWEET. Go to sweetwholetones.com. Now enjoy the show. All right, welcome back to Truth Be Told with Tony and Eddie. I'm Tony Sweet with
Rachel Lang.
and
Captain Ron.
And we are here with an amazing journalist, man, author, whatever
Athlete.
you want, athlete,
Right.
whatever you want to call him, Thomas J. Carey. He wrote the book, The Children of Roswell, and you can go to his website, roswellinvestigator.com. And I think Captain Ron's going to take the first question because he has it already waiting for you.
Yeah, I was thinking about this. Tom, you and Don both your books are written very, very specifically, and you can tell you guys are very careful about not to overstep what you're saying. When you quote somebody, you're very careful with it. You can tell that you didn't say he saw a body. You could say that he saw a box. You're very careful with that. I was wondering if you could share something with us that's outside of the book that maybe didn't make it into the book that you couldn't really write because it really didn't have the hard, but maybe something that could have almost made it. What do you got? Anything?
Wow. We've got so many other witnesses because we're confined by the word count. That we contract for a certain number of words and a certain number of photos. I had some terrific photos that I wanted to use in the book that were turned down because of space. For instance, we had one of the children of Roswell, one of a favorite son actually, was an NFL football player named Tom Brookshire. And I knew Tom as being a Philadelphia Eagles fan. I knew him as a all-pro defensive back. for the Philadelphia Eagles. And I never knew he came from Roswell until 2008 when I interviewed him, and he had a wonderful story. He remembered he was 16 years old at the time, and he had two encounters with the actual event. And I wanted to use, because he's certainly known around Philadelphia. He died in 2010 of cancer, and most people in the country would know him from being a broadcaster for CBS when they broadcast the Sunday afternoon football games. In the 1970s, he was the Tom Brookshire and fellow from the New York Giants, I can't remember, Pat Summerall, were a team that did the football broadcast. So I wanted to use pictures, and but the editor declined, and so that's one example. Another example is when we have a chapter on, it's called Richard's Cave. There was this cave that we had heard about for years, that this witness, Dan Richards, who had died in 1965 as a teenager, he had a cave that he kept strange things in. And the story was that he had gotten out to the site before the military and had recovered some pieces of the wreckage and stored them in his secret cave. The problem is, up around Corona, where he lived, the town of Corona, the area is mostly limestone, and it's filled with lots of caves. So we didn't know which one was his. So Don Schmidt and I, we decided, well, let's go to Richard's Ranch, see who's still there, and ask them if they know where Richard's Cave is. And so I originally had written a description of this ranch that we had to take out because it was too descriptive. It was unbelievable.
Be a tourist site next day.
Yeah, exactly.
Next Roswell.
Yeah, it was. What I had originally written was what I felt at the time is like, see, Don Schmidt and I, neither one of us have ever smoked. We don't smoke. We never have. Well, we went into the ranch. I want to say the living room, but that's too good a word. It was the first room we went in, and I was immediately gagging because of the stale stench of cigarette smoke. And so we entered the room, and over to my left was a elderly gentleman sitting in a chair with smoking a cigarette. With his ashtray was piled a foot high with ashes. I'm thinking, my goodness, how is that man still alive? I mean, every time he took a puff, his lungs lit up. And so I also noticed that the dog was wearing a smoking jacket. And the little insects, like the little insects running across the floor, they had smoking jackets. So I was like, oh my goodness, what have we got here? So we went in, we sat down. I guess it was the dining room table. That's a guess. And so we started. The woman of the house. We said, okay, can you tell us what you know about your cousin? Dan Richards was her cousin, and well, in comes this fellow out from the outside. He's obviously Mexican. He looks like one of the banditos from the movie The Magnificent Seven. Do you remember that movie?
Yes,
Yeah.
Sure.
He was one of he looked like a bandito. I mean, there's a picture of him in the book. I have to tell you, I took that picture, and it's my favorite picture of all time. It looks like he's been chewing on his hat. So he sits down right across from me. He says, are you a lawyer? I said, no. He says, because if you are, I'm coming over there and I'm gonna kill you. Oh my goodness. And he says, who's that fella behind you? I said, well, that's my associate, Don Schmidt. Now, Don Schmidt always wears, for some reason, he oftentimes wears all black. like black wingtips, black pants, black shirt, black sunglasses. He looks like a revenuer. And he says, so the fella was his name was Trinidad Chavez. I want to say Trini Lopez, but Trini Chavez. He says, "What about him? Is he a government agent?" I said, "No, he's okay. He's okay." Because I was going to kill him too. And so finally, after we got him to calm down, and he told us his story of how he was connected to the Roswell incident, and he actually got out to the crash site with Dan Richards. But describing that scene in the house, it was like scary. And so it's getting time for us to leave. We've heard their stories, and so I looked over behind me, and here the woman, she's in the kitchen, and she has what looks like the hind quarter of a calf or a sheep or something with fur. You could still see the hoof in a pot cooking. And I'm going, oh my goodness.
Roadkill.
Yeah, it's like
I
roadkill.
didn't
That's
need that visual.
What is she cooking there? I can't imagine that. She says, you boys are staying for dinner, aren't you? I said, no.
Oh, we really
got to go. Yeah.
Just
Really gotta
ate.
go. And I go, right, Don, and Don's over there licking his chops like he's going to get some dinner. Oh, geez, what's going on? I don't believe any of this. It was like the Twilight Zone. The Twilight Zone.
Well, the meat was smoked at least.
Had to delete,
Exactly.
we had to delete all the atmospherics that I just told you about from the, because we thought maybe we'd get sued for something. So help me, it happened.
Well, I have a question. Going back to the Children of Roswell, I know there's a lot of stories that you could tell us, and because of time, and we don't want to give away the whole book either, can you give us a couple that really stuck out to you, that really that truly believed that they were part and they were telling you the 100% truth?
Oh wow, there's a lot of them. I mentioned Tom Brookshire.
Right.
What he was involved in was he was an athlete. He was a 3-sport athlete: baseball, football, basketball. Made all pro in football. I said, "Do you remember the 1947 incident?" He says, "Oh, sure." And he said, "What he remembered the most was that when this happened, it was like a curtain had dropped over the base, around the base. Nothing was getting in and nothing was getting out except by aircraft. And when the curtain was lifted after a few days, nobody on the base would talk to the townsfolk anymore. It was obviously they were told not to talk about it. So the way they handled it was they just didn't talk to the townsfolk anymore. And Tom told me that it was never the same between the base and the town again after that.
Wow.
And the other thing was Tom's father owned a service station on Main Street in town, and a lot of the servicemen would fill up their cars at his father's gas station. Well, in the summertime, Tom would help out by pumping gas at the station. And he knew a lot of the guys on the base, and he said, yeah, they all stopped talking to me. Well, this one day, shortly after the event, some of his buddies from the football team at Roswell High came over and said, hey, Tom, did you see what Roy Tyner has? Now, Roy Tyner is a welder. He's got his own shop. The shop's still there. I saw it 2 weeks ago. The shop is still there. He's dead, but he says, Roy's got this funny piece of metal. It's the strangest thing I ever saw. So Tom says, let's go look at it. I don't know what you're talking about. I want to see this. So they walk over to Tyner's welding shop, and Tyner sees him, and he lifts up his welder's mask and says, what do you guys want? We want to see that piece of metal you got. Oh, get out of here. No, we're not leaving till we see it. So Tyner walks over to his desk. He pulls out a drawer, and he reaches in and he pulls out something that he's got wadded up in his hand. So he holds it out shoulder high toward the boys. He opens his hand, and out floats this piece of metal. It's just floating there.
Holy crap.
It unfurled itself, and it's just floating, and they're dumbfounded. So they do that again, do that again. So Roy grabs the piece of metal, he does it again, and it's just floating there instead of falling to the ground. It's floating there in the air. And so he grabs it. Now, you boys have seen enough. Now get out of here. And so they start going out, and Tom says, well, where did you get that? Where did you get that? Oh, he said, well, a friend of mine, Joe, he gave it to me, and he said he got it up at a crash site of a UFO. Well, they didn't call it UFO back then, flying saucer, north of town. That's where he got it, and he gave it to me. So that's in the book. That Tom Brookshire was one of the famous sons of Roswell. He was just Hollywood good looks. He great athlete, terrific personality. The incident never affected him at all in his life. On the other hand, you have a family like the sheriff's family, who were severely threatened with death if they ever talk. Now, the sheriff, you got to figure, he helped out the Air Force or the Air Corps back then by taking messages and by delivering the message to keep quiet or else. So when it was over and he saw an Air Force Jeep pull up in front of his station, he said, oh, they're coming over here to give me a medal or something, or tell me what a great job I did. Well, it was anything but that. They grabbed the sheriff, they put him in a hammerlock and shoved him face first up against the wall.
Wow.
Just like a common criminal. And this is the sheriff of Chavez County, who technically had control of the entire county, including where the base was located. He's up against the wall, and they said, if you ever talk about this, we're going to kill you and your wife and your children and grandchildren. Well, now he died in 1961, the sheriff did. He was the first key player in this to pass away that we know. And so when we interviewed his daughters, we asked them about, well, how did it affect your family? And she says, well, the incident destroyed my father, the sheriff. Destroyed him. He was the sheriff. He deals with a lot of stuff. Well, it destroyed him. He never ran for sheriff again. He wound up in a mental hospital, and he died shortly after that. And we got that story not from the sheriff, not from his wife, who died in 1978, just before we got on the case. But we actually got the full story from his granddaughter and his grandson. And it's quite a story. His wife, Inez, believed that the sheriff that the base called him out again to the base, and they roughed him up a second time.
Wow. Because
she said he came back, and he had this faraway look on his face, and he said he never wanted to be sheriff anymore. And shortly thereafter, he had an early onset of Alzheimer's and quickly passed away. His wife believed that the Air Force had done something to him besides roughing him up.
That's plausible
that gives
to me.
Me chills.
Yeah, I
Literally.
wouldn't put it past
Yeah.
They did something else to him. And the grandson, who I interviewed last year, nobody else had interviewed him. He said that he had spent the summer with the Wilcoxes, and it was clear to him that the sheriff at that point was paranoid, totally paranoid, because whenever a car would go by the house, he would jump out of the chair, run over to the window, and look out like he was scared somebody was following him.
Wow.
Hey, Tom, we're running out of time here, but I want to ask you this about your book. Obviously, the first book, you were able to get more people, but it's been 70 years now. A lot of people have died off. It's been 70 years. A lot of the Roswell actual witnesses are gone. That's why you went to the children, which is brilliant. In those children, just like you mentioned Jesse Marcel, his son got to actually handle the material. That's a famous thing, that his son physically touched the material himself. Did you see any more children that had the first-person account, like the kids got a chance to either touch the material or see the bodies or something?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Number of children, and we cite them in the book, actually handled the material. We have one case where the girl was 12 years old at the time. She had been in town for a dental appointment, and her father was a fireman. And so when the dental appointment was over, she went to the firehouse to wait for him so he would drive her home. While she's waiting there, in comes a deputy, not a deputy, but a highway patrolman. He's on his way home, lived in a town south of Roswell. So he comes in the firehouse. He says, "Hey, fellas, take a look at this." And he whips out a piece of this, what we call memory metal. It's our holy grail. That's what we're looking for all these years. The memory metal that Roy Tyner had shown the boys, where you wad it up and it unfurls itself. You can't cut it, scratch it, burn it, do anything to it of a permanent nature. So he throws that on the table, and everybody in the firehouse had a crack at handling it, including the fireman's daughter, Frankie Dwyer. And so she has a vivid description of what this memory metal looked like and what it did. Well, her father drives her home. He finally comes in. Turns out the father had been out to the site on his own. And so that evening, they're sitting around the table, and the firemen, they said, "Well, where were you today, dear?" "Well, I was out north of town at a crash site." And he told them about seeing the strange wreckage, but then his eyes became fixated on two small beings lying on the ground. And he says, "Oh my goodness, they're children." Well, he got closer. He says, "No, they're not children, not with big heads like that." So while he's looking at that, trying to figure out what's going on, he catches some movement out of the corner of his eye. And there is a being from another world stumbling around, 3.5 to 4 feet tall, big, large, pear-shaped head. Obviously, one of the occupants had survived. So the family wanted to know, well, first, what did it look like? And I've already given you a description. And well, did you talk to it, Dad? Did you talk to it? Well, yes, we did talk to one another, but not like we're talking with our mouth. We talk to one another in our heads. And today we would call that mental telepathy, but they didn't have that term back then, or at least they didn't know it. They just said, we talk to one another in our heads. Well, what did it tell you? Or what did you talk about? Well, I didn't. He said, I didn't do much talking. It did most of the talking. It was concerned that I was worried about it, and it told me not to worry. Don't concern yourself, because I accept my fate.
Wow.
My ship has crashed.
Wow.
My comrades are dead, and I have no means to get back
Plausible.
home.
Yeah.
And that was the message it gave him when the military pulled up.
Wow, that's
Oh
incredible.
my God, that makes you almost feel sad.
Yeah,
now.
I know.
Before we get out of here, Rachel had a story that she wanted to tell you.
I had one question. So I've actually spoken to two people who have been children of Roswell, where their parents were involved. And through my work.
Me their names.
No, I can't do that on air. But they both noticed. Both of them told me that they feel a real strong connection to aliens. One of these people actually he said, these are my brothers. He feels like a certain kinship. And also, they both expressed that they have like physical tremors or shaking, or that something's a little bit different with their electromagnetic frequencies. Were there any kind of physical symptoms or anything like that you heard in your stories?
Not what you described as far as shaking or something, because you figure most of the people we were talking to were in their 70s, 80s, and 90s, so they're shaking already.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the connection. We had a witness. He was a lieutenant colonel. He had had a contact with the live, we call it the live one, at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the spring of 1948. He was in the Air War College class. They were flown to Wright-Patterson for a week's observation of how the base was run. Well, they took the class into a special room about 45 of them, and they showed them this strange wreckage. And of course, nobody could figure out where this wreckage came from. So they said, "Where did you get this?" Well, and they were honest. They said, "We got it from a crash of a flying saucer in New Mexico from last year." So they followed them into another room. And in this room, there was all just four blank walls, but it had this two-way mirror, like from a James Bond movie, the two-way mirror. You can see through it, but they can't see you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, they looked through the mirror, and there was the live one. Now, I don't know if it was doing push-ups or dancing or what it was doing, but the witness said he had a strong mental connection with it, of sympathy. He said, "We didn't talk to one another, but I felt this mental connection with it of sympathy, and I had a feeling of its human type qualities rather than its alien type qualities." So when you said they had a mental connection, that rings with what one of the witnesses had told us.
Well, I have to say, this has been one of the fascinating episodes we've ever had, over 300.
You need the 4.5 hours, Tony.
I know,
Right.
I know. I was joking earlier
Yeah.
about a 4.5 hour, but we're definitely, we'd love to have you back. We have so much more to talk about. I want to have you back again and talk about your book also, Inside the Real Area 51. If you
We
would.
finally figured out we've got Hangar 18 nailed. We got it nailed.
Well, will you accept our invitation? I'm going to make sure you say yes right now so I can have it on tape. But we really do appreciate Tom Carey for calling in today, Skyping in, and giving us his accounts of the research that he's done with, multiple books, but especially the latest book, the Children of Roswell.
And if anybody has any witness names or any information, they can go through the show here and they'll pass it along to me.
Yes, and hopefully, maybe, like I said, Rachel, maybe if your clients might do that.
Yeah.
But we want to thank you so much, and we appreciate you joining us today. For everybody out there, if you want to go to our website, truthbetoldwebtv.com, you can definitely find out other guests coming up, and we have some great shows for you. They may not be as interesting as Tom, though, I have to say. All right, Tom, thank you so much for calling in. We appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, take care. We'll talk to you later, sir.
Bye.
All right. Well, Rachel, where can people find you?
Blissenup.com is my website. I'm also on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, you name it.
And Captain Ron.
I am on none of those things, but I am at iamdr420.com.
And make sure you watch his show right here on UBN Radio.
Thursday nights at 9.
And it's going to be a great go around again when we have Tom back, because I loved having him here. So, all right, guys, we thank you so much. Listen to us on YouTube. Find us on iTunes, iHeartRadio, many other locations. But until then, stick around. We have another great guest right after this. We're going to take a little break, and we'll be right back.